We welcome you to Virasat Hind Foundation
Thank
for
you.
a small interview, and we would like to know something about you and the work you do to popularize history among mass.
So I basically write thrillers
Okay.
which blend history, mythology, and science as well.
Hmm.
So far my books have been based on the Mahabharata.
Hmm.
So I bring in an event or an episode or a character from the Mahabharata
Hmm.
and link it with science, and then also link it to something in history. So usually what I look for is mysteries in history which are not explained in the historical record, about which there are question marks. And there are lots of those things, where you can't really say for sure what happened or what something is about.
Hmm.
So I bring those elements and then I convert them into a work of fiction.
Okay.
And what I tend to find is that based on feedback from readers is since the history is factual,
Hmm.
the connections I make may be fictional, but the basic facts are historically
Hmm.
accurate.
Hmm.
Uh, so people start seeing history in a very different way. It suddenly becomes more interesting,
Hmm. Hmm.
and everyone likes a good mystery.
Hmm. Hmm.
So what I've I've seen tends to happen is when the readers read about something. So when I wrote about Alexander the Great, for example, I put in a lot of historical facts,
Hmm.
and people couldn't make out which part was fiction and which part was fact.
Hmm.
So then they went and started researching
Hmm.
to find out, what is the real history. And I also give at the end of all my books, I give an explanation of what are the facts and what is fiction in the book, because I don't want people to think that there are, I don't want to present facts as fiction
Hmm. Hmm.
or present fiction as facts.
Hmm.
And that suddenly becomes interesting, because of that I find that people suddenly start reading more history and wanting to know more.
Okay. Hmm.
And because I use a lot of different locations in my books,
Hmm.
and I usually travel to those locations and see them firsthand personally.
Okay.
So people also start seeing a very different view of that location, because I'm describing it in a very different way from what it's described in the textbook.
Hmm.
So in the textbook, for example, it would be like what you see in the museum here.
Hmm.
The bricks were this size,
Size, yes.
these,
Hmm.
they were
Hmm.
kiln baked or
Hmm. Hmm.
dried, sun dried, or whatever. In my case, for example, we were discussing that the difference of the size of the bricks.
Hmm.
I would put in a fictional element over there to explain why the bricks are of different size.
Hmm.
And then suddenly people would realize, oh, there was a standardization, the bricks were of a certain size, and so on. When they read it in a textbook, it's very boring.
Hmm.
But when they read it in a book which has got a story, it suddenly becomes interesting. So that's really what
Okay.
I'm trying to do to
Right.
make history more interesting.
Okay. So how this idea came to you?
Um, I always wanted to write something to do with the Mahabharata,
Okay.
but I didn't want to rewrite or retell the Mahabharata like a lot of authors do. They take the same story and then they just put it in a more modern way. At the same time, I wanted to present a slightly different way of looking at the Mahabharata.
Hmm.
So I started exploring, if I could connect science and the Mahabharata, because there are lots of things in the Mahabharata that seem to be like magic. Especially when you look at it, the fact that the events are supposed to have happened 5,000-6,000 years ago,
Okay.
and but at the same time, if you look at the latest technology, if you don't understand the latest technology, it is like magic. So if someone who walks into a room and doesn't know how electricity works, you put on a switch and the light comes on, and they will think, oh, it's magic, the light has come on its own. If they don't see you putting the switch on. If you can remote control, put on a TV and a face appears. Someone who doesn't know what a television is, will think it's magic. How did this face suddenly appear and is talking to me? So using that analogy, I tried to see if I could actually explain some of the things in the Mahabharata using science. So while connecting science and the Mahabharata, I also decided to bring in history, because again, presenting history in a very different way, like I do in my books, presenting the mysteries and trying to give fictional answers for those mysteries. I thought it would make it a very interesting plot line. The story becomes much more interesting, because you're not just relating mythology and science, then you're also relating something in the historical record, because there are a lot of historical facts which I present. And that, when I started putting the story together, it just kind of fell together. So I'd actually started my first book. It started with Ashoka the Great,
Okay.
I came across a legend about Ashoka the Great, that he created a secret society. Now this is a legend.
Hmm.
It's called the Brotherhood of the Nine Unknown Men,
Okay.
and
So where is this legend?
it's there on the website. If you
Okay.
Google Nine Unknown Men,
Uh-huh.
you'll find a lot of information about
Okay.
them.
Hmm.
So it's a very fantastic legend. But I decided again to connect it to the Mahabharata. So uh, the Mahabharata is said to have been written down between 500 BC and 200 BC, somewhere around that time. It's
Okay.
not
Hmm.
accurately placed when,
Hmm.
but it very conveniently falls around the
Ashoka's
time when
time.
Ashoka was there. So I used that fact and said, what if Ashoka had deliberately left out or ensured that one book of the Mahabharata was deleted from the written Mahabharata, and we don't know about it? And why did he do it? He did it because he found something from the Mahabharata which can be explained using science, and he felt it was too dangerous to reveal it to the world. And so he hid it away forever and took out that book from the Mahabharata. And then I converted that story into a thriller. So
Okay.
there's a historical record because we know about Ashoka the Great. I brought his edicts in. That's all factual. I found meanings hidden inside the edicts, which I used to, create a greater curiosity about Ashoka the Great, and created a thriller format which is set in modern times.
Okay.
So that's how it first started. Then I went on to Alexander the Great. Then I went on to Julius Caesar as historical figures. But everywhere it comes back to the Mahabharata in India. The connections are there.
Okay. So your interest is more on Indian history, no? Like
It's-
ancient India,
It's
Mahabharata, Ashoka,
yes,
Alexander.
it's ancient Indian ancient history. The first two books focused a lot on the Indian part of it. Though Alexander was Greek, but even then I dwell on his invasion or the supposed invasion of India,
Northwest India.
coming to India. But in the third book, what I've done is I've taken Julius Caesar and the historical record of his invasions of Britain, and I have linked that to the Mahabharata. So what I've done is I've linked British history and Indian history and British mythology and Indian mythology, and used science to provide the linkage.
Yeah, this is amazing actually. First thing is that when we are reading Indian history, we read in isolation. So we don't situate India in a wider world context.
Right.
I think this
Right.
is what is missing out when
Absolutely.
children are learning or even adults are learning Indian history.
Absolutely.
So what was happening, like you talk about spice trade, like our Dutch coming to India, you talk about tombs. So at the same time, you could also show the wider connection.
Correct. Correct. Absolutely.
And then it becomes, because the way we are moving towards globalizations and things, we can't isolate India from the rest of the world when we are referring to Indian history even.
Correct.
Because-
Because there was globalization then
Yes.
also.
Yeah, even starting from Harappan time,
Correct.
where we are sitting just now,
Right.
there was trade going on between Persia and Persian Gulf, through Persian Gulf and Harappan civilizations.
Right.
And yeah, it is there throughout the history we have. So this is what I think Virasat-e Hind's approach is also, to some extent, like how do we situate India in the wider global history?
Absolutely.
Because
I think it's a great thing you're doing, because
Yeah.
I've always felt that the way history is taught in schools and in our text, it's not the teachers, it's the textbooks and the curriculum. It's more on, you have to memorize dates and names of people, whereas history can be so much more fun and so much more
Yes.
interesting.
right,
I mean, just imagine coming over here and seeing something like this, 4,500 years old, and trying to guess some of the mysteries that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Bricks of a different size. What is the shape? Is there a connection with Greece? All
Yes,
these.
yes.
These are questions. Now, they will not all have answers.
yes,
But if children can be taught to ask these questions, it means they're thinking about it and they're learning much more.
yeah,
Even if they don't get the answers, the fun, I think, is in asking the questions and knowing that there are some questions which you will never get answered in the historical record.
yeah. I'll give you a small example. Like a week before, I had gone to Surat, and my interest was to interview Mr. Dotiwala. He is a Parsi gentleman, and he has a connection with Dutch. He is running the oldest bakery in India.
Right.
Actually, when the Dutch were traders in India, they had their factory in Surat, and they left somewhere in 1749 or 50, sometime around that. And then they handed over their bakery to his great grandfather.
Right.
So he's the sixth generation.
Wow.
Mr. Pestonji Dotiwala he became the owner of that Dutch bakery. And then he tried out with different, because they were using tadi as a fermenting things, because, and that was not acceptable among Hindus because it was alcoholic. So then he came out with different ideas. Then the concept of dry bread came in, and then the famous Suti Nankatai, which is today known all over Western India.
Right.
Surat is the place,
Right.
and it was invented. So we interviewed him, and then when we tried to show the link food, Dutch history, as well as Parsi history,
Right.
and local history. So it was an amazing experiment, and he was
Yes.
so happy because he himself, when we'll show you, I'll give you the link. So that is how I think it can be made more interesting when we show the present connection, and then bringing in the global ideas as well.
Correct. Absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, I think yes, I would love to read some of the, when I go now, I'll get these books and read. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for showing me around.
Yeah.
It's been
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.